Welcome back. As a reminder, if you need assistance today, the help desk is available. Thank you for joining our session titled The Power of Feedback, Using Data to Tell Our Story, Generate Feedback, and Promote Improvement. My name is Vanessa Ambergy, and I am the data lead for the Capacity Building Center for States. I've worked in child welfare and information systems for over 10 years in both state and national forums, and I'll be facilitating the conversation today. With me I have Elisa Lee, who is currently the Indian Child Welfare Administrator for Utah's Division of Child and Family Services, and also serves as the Native American Liaison for the Utah Department of Human Services. And Michaela Guthrie, who is the Program Executive for Crossroads Foster Care and Adoption Program with Christian City Incorporated in Atlanta, Georgia, a program she developed and launched. As a former foster youth and licensed professional social worker, Michaela has been involved in various child welfare panels and trainings. Michael Tanana is currently a research assistant professor at the University of Utah and Chief Technology Officer for Listen.io. Dr. Tanana's research focuses on statistical analysis for psychology and public health, applied machine learning for the behavioral sciences, and cloud-based software engineering. Today, our session will explore the importance of building capacity and skills to effectively communicate and consume data at all levels of the workforce and across stakeholder groups. Participants will see examples of data visualizations used to communicate data, hear recommendations for incorporating data visualizations as part of feedback loops, and as a mechanism for supporting improvement. And we'll explore how telling a story can be part of a child welfare system's effort to create a culture of data use. To start, Dr. Tanana is going to present an overview of feedback as a process for how people learn.
Thanks everyone for being here. Before we get in and really discuss some of the finer grained aspects of feedback, I think it's worth actually talking about why that's even a useful thing to do. You know, why should we spend the next hour and a half thinking about feedback? And for me, the rationale is pretty simple. It is very unlikely that any of us here or virtually here are going to obtain expertise in the domains that we practice in. And it's not because we're not smart enough. It's not because we're not trying hard enough. And it's not because we don't care. When you look at psychology, the research on psychology outcomes, if you are practicing for 40 years, there's no evidence to show that you're any better than someone who just came out of school. There's no evidence to show that people who have PhDs get outcomes that are any better than people with master's degrees. And it gets worse. It turns out that there's no evidence to show that psychologists get better outcomes with patients than kind English professors. And so there's sort of a crisis in our field that we really need to solve. Now, there are domains in which people do obtain expertise. When you look at airline pilots, when you look at surgeons, there's actually lots of evidence showing that the longer you do those things, the better that you get at them. So I used to work with neurosurgeons. I was a statistician. I would analyze their data. And I was working with this one neurosurgeon, and he was testing cutting tools on the brain, right? So he got all these pig brains, and he would test out these different cutting tools on them. And he gave me a spreadsheet with all the data, cutting tool, how much damage they cause. And I was like, oh, this is great. This is going to be a good paper. But just a question, how do you know how much damage these tools cause? And he said, well, we look at the damage that the tools cause, you know? And that's such a foreign thing to us in the human services that you can just look and see if you've done things right, if you've done a good job. And so, you know, when it comes to doctors, they're not better decision makers, they're not smarter, they're not better than any of us. but there are certain parts of their job, like surgery, where they're getting this immediate feedback in everything they do, and as a result, the longer they do it, the better that they get. And so when I say expertise, I don't mean sort of an accumulated knowledge about a domain. I define expertise the way Daniel Kahneman defines expertise, which is the ability to learn based on quality information. And so when we're talking about feedback, that's what we mean. Feedback in order to develop that kind of expertise. Not expertise that's just to be able to discuss a domain, but it's the expertise where you can learn based on your experience in that domain. And so before we spend the next hour talking about feedback, I think it's useful to define it pretty carefully. Feedback in the learning sciences is defined very well and studied very thoroughly. Feedback isn't just sort of that soft feedback of, make sure you speak louder next time you're on stage. Feedback, the most important kind of feedback, is what we call criterion information. You can think of it like outcomes, right? It's basically, does what you do get you to the goal that you're interested in? So there's 4 kinds of feedback that learning scientists define. 3 of them are effective and 1 is not. The most important kind is what I was just talking about. Feedback based on criterion information. If you were doing a math problem, this would be like someone saying, you got the answer right. Not saying anything about the process, right? But just, yeah, that was correct. You got the problem right. If you're a mental health practitioner, this would be something like, your patient got better. If you were in child welfare, this would be something like, yeah, your client obtained permanency. And so it's just that very coarse level of information. And we have research showing that even this very coarse information that doesn't say why it happened actually improves outcomes. So just telling people outcomes improves outcomes, you know? That humans, when we're given that reliable information, we learn, we get better. The second kind of feedback is feedback on the processing of the task. And so this is sort of the, when you're working through a math problem, it's like a strategy for how you get to that correct answer. That feedback is effective. The third kind of feedback, and this is kind of surprising, is based on motivation. How can you give people feedback on how they manage their emotions when they're dealing with a problem, right? We're human beings, that it is useful for us to not just think about, the robotic actions of getting good outcomes, but also how do you manage, your motivation of getting to that goal, because it takes work, it takes time, it takes effort. Now, the fourth kind of feedback has been shown consistently to be ineffective, and that's feedback where you're talking about someone else as a person. You're good at that, you're bad at that. That kind of feedback is not effective, and it doesn't change outcomes. And I think we go to this naturally as people, right? It's very easy to talk about somebody else as a person. And so when we say feedback, those are the key things. The most important one, the one that has the biggest impact, is that criterion information. Now, when I began this talk, I started off with sort of a depressing thought, right? That we're not going to obtain expertise. Now, I want to caveat that. It's unlikely that we'll obtain expertise if nothing changes. But what's really exciting is that we could be at the cusp, the beginning of a golden age for our field. That there are tools and processes available that just would have been impossible 30 years ago. And if we can leverage these tools, we can fundamentally change our field. We could change our field from one where we're not really getting better at it as we go along to one where, yeah, fundamentally someone starts in the field, and by the time they've been practicing for 20 years, they're really good at it, that they're getting better outcomes than people when they start their careers. So I think in child welfare, one of the most exciting things is thanks to federal regulations, people have these databases just sitting there that have all of the outcome information that we care about. So in child welfare, states are required generally to collect certain informations on the kids that are in their care, on what happens to the kids after they leave their care. And if people would just take this data and turn it into something useful, something accessible, all of a sudden, a domain where there's not reliable outcome data attached to the things that we do can become one where it's very common for us to know what happens to kids after they leave our care. Practitioners could have access to this data where they see how they're doing, what their permanency rate is. The computational power, the cost of a server, running a server right now that's doing this stuff every night is inexpensive, almost free. One of the areas that I work in, that's one of the most exciting areas, is natural language processing. We can teach computers now to do motivational interviewing adherence, something that normally only trained practitioners could do before. And we can do it at perfect scale. You don't have to have an expert in the room to give you feedback. We now can give people feedback in a way that scales beyond the number of experts that we have. And so all of that to say, something needs to change, or we're going to be left in a domain where we're just not getting better over time. But there are tools available to us now where we could fundamentally change the game. That you can either think, well, that's a depressing thought, I'm going to try not to think about that, or you can think, this is when I really change my field.
Next, we're going to explore aspects of incorporating feedback into both child welfare agencies and with stakeholders, and the importance of making an active choice in seeking and utilizing feedback in day-to-day work. To start, let's examine why it's a good idea to look for feedback and explore problems before the problem gets too big.
Yeah, I'll start with Vanessa. When I think about that, I think about staff and how, setting a culture of empowerment with staff and having them come to you with issues and, being transparent about how they're feeling with their caseload and just their day-to-day work. And a perfect example, I think, of that is with car maintenance. If you're regularly maintaining your oil, for example, it's a cheap fit. It's $40 to $70. However, if you're not maintaining that regularly, then you run into a big issue and your car might not start, and it's a $3,000 fix or whatever. You have to buy a new car. And so thinking about before an issue gets too big, if you're having those conversations with your staff about how they're feeling, then they're not having sick days as regularly, or they're not having poor work performance, or they're not turning over. And so I think that's a great example of, thinking about a problem before it gets too big. And also model sensitivity to your staff about how to have those tough conversations with their clients and builds on that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I also think that feedback is a major component in working with tribes, because often we have workers in our state system that haven't worked with tribes before. They don't understand the tribal governments and how tribes are sovereign. And so it's really important that you work with those tribal communities and assess how they think we're doing our job, and if that job is something that they feel like we've developed a strong relationship with them. In Utah, we have 8 federally recognized tribes, so we work really hard to go out to those communities and assess our work with them. And often tribes tell us, come out to our communities. We don't always want to go to Salt Lake and tell you how we're doing. Come out and see us. And so we really make an investment in that feedback process and going to those communities and talking to them directly and developing those relationships of trust.
It's an old saying that what gets measured gets managed, and there's some truth in that when you're looking for feedback within child welfare about exploring discrepancies within special populations. and really paying attention to the outcomes of the individuals who make up those populations. And I think that's something that we've seen in Utah, and looking at discrepancies among populations in the child welfare population.
Right, absolutely. And the important part about feedback is making sure that you're reaching out to those populations on an ongoing basis. Not that you're responding to some crisis and it's a one and done type of issue, but that you really work with those communities continuously. And I think that, you know, obviously with tribes there is historical mistrust. And so they want to know, if you're coming out to their community, what are you giving back to that community? Are you coming just to get the information and go back to the state and report to the governor and then you're done? Or is this a commitment that's institutionalized within your agency? And that's what we've really tried to do in Utah. It's not just the Division of Child and Family Services that's working with the tribes. We also engage our court improvement program. We engage our Attorney General's office, our guardian ad litems, our parental defense. We're a community of agencies that work together, and we include the tribes as well. And I think that that shows the tribes how committed we are to them, and that's helped us have such amazing relationships with our tribal governments.
And you're not waiting for there to be a problem before you start knocking on people's doors. You're building that relationship ahead of time.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's easy to get trapped into thinking that what you see in your day-to-day work is what's common, or that an extreme case is what you remember, and overestimate what a typical experience looks like in your system. And Mike, I think there's some research in this area that can really speak to that.
Yeah, you know, one of, I think the things that's common in a lot of different domains is that people tend to focus on the cases that are the most salient. There's something called the availability heuristic. So the idea is that as humans, when we try and think broadly about what's common, what's uncommon, that we tend to focus on the things that come to our mind first. So when you talk to mental health providers and you say, you know, in a public mental health system, what kind of case are you most likely to see? They'll say, well, it's someone who's schizophrenic, has bipolar disorder, maybe has housing problems, and they're here every month and they're going to be here for the next 5 years. We probably know their name. When you look at the data, it turns out the most common person they see is someone who has a job, someone who has minor depression, and they might be there for 1 or 2 appointments and then they leave and never come back. In the child welfare population, there's a similar thing that happens where you know, when you're talking to administrators, you know, and you ask them what kind of cases are they most concerned with, and they'll say, well, the cases that cause the most problems are these high mental health kids. They might go through 20 or 30 placements. They cost an inordinate amount of money, but those might be, you know, 100 cases in the whole system. And the most common case in the system is someone who's in foster care for less than 6 months, probably ends up in a permanent placement, probably has a parent with substance abuse problems or was charged with neglect. And so these biases have a real impact on the system, because if you focus on those salient cases are the hardest ones to impact. And they impact a small number of kids. And so one of the things I think we need to do as a system is to use data to help take us away from our own human biases and think broadly about a system so that we can have the largest impact on the largest number of kids.
Yeah. And Michaela, you have an example of the power in maintaining curiosity within individuals and not assuming that you know what's going on in somebody's life.
Yeah, for sure. I think that what you said is so important, that, you know, we do assume, and I think we should not assume, and we should always think that our clients have the best intentions, and meeting clients where they are. And it's so important to just ask the question rather than assume. And so I have a good example, like you said, of that, where we had a child who was being late to school on the regular, like every single day, and couldn't child was missing class and, missing important assignments, and mom was about to be charged with truancy. And so it's really easy in that situation thinking that, mom's just not doing what she's supposed to do, child is unruly, whatever the case is. Or when we finally got down to it and asked the mom, why is the child late to school every day? It was as simple as mom didn't have an alarm clock. And so such an easy fix, $3 to $5 fix, because someone finally asked the question. So I think, just meeting the client where they are is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I love that example of the alarm clock and capacity, because often I'm run into that same issue with tribal governments. When the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, it was in response to a crisis. There were 25 to 35% of Native kids who were removed from their homes. And when they were removed, 85 to 90% were placed in non-Indian placements. And many of these kids never got back to their tribal communities. And so sometimes it's hard for many of us who work in state government to understand the capacity of tribes and what resources they may or may not have. I myself come from a very small tribal community in California, and we simply do not have a child welfare department. We don't even have a child welfare staff member, so often it comes on the elected officials who do not have child welfare experience oftentimes. So you really have to look at the capacity of who you're working with and understand and try to meet that tribe where they're at. And one of the things that I loved about your example of using data also directly applies to tribes as well, because when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, there was a protection in there that allowed for cases to be transferred to a tribal government. And sometimes that's scary for us that work in state governments to think about transferring your child welfare case to a tribal government, because maybe you're not familiar with their capacity. And I love that data has helped us change that perception, change that bias sometimes that is present. And one of the things that we always promote is just the great work that the Ute Indian tribe has done in Utah. They in particular have been able to place 85% of their kids in kinship placements, which consistently outpaces our state kinship rate. So educating our judges, educating our child welfare staff and our partners about what a great job the tribe is doing has really changed some of those perceptions and stereotypes that all of us have. So I love both of your examples, and I think they're directly applicable to the work that I do with tribal governments.
So I'd like to take a moment to examine the role of data visualizations in the feedback process. So early in my career, I worked with the Division of Child Family Services in Utah, and Mike and I worked with a team of child welfare experts and evaluation teams to develop a data visualization tool that used administrative data to provide feedback to service providers. This tool gave each provider access to a system that displayed characteristics like whether they aggregated the children together into dashboard-like displays, including information about what brought the children into care, what happened after the child left the provider's services. It also contextualized information which allowed providers to compare the children in their care to other like children within the system. We started this process with the intention of exploring the fit between the children that were coming into a provider and the services that that provider focused on and emphasized most. And it was an early attempt to look for both fit and effectiveness in the treatment process. But we had some unexpected outcomes of that process. One of those was bringing attention to permanency as a goal. So Mike, can you take a minute and talk about how that worked?
Yeah, so this is, one of the things that excites me the most is that when you look across the country, systems, child welfare systems, have these amazing databases that are tracking kids over time, tracking families, tracking assessments, and a lot of times this data is just sort of sitting there, right? They're required to collect it. People are putting it into little forms, but no one is aggregating it. No one is taking it and putting it in a form where where providers can potentially benefit from it, where systems can benefit from it. And so this was a really exciting project that was a partnership between the Social Research Institute and the Department of Child and Family Services in Utah. And you know, the goal of it was to basically take this data, this outcome data, and make it accessible to providers. So providers could log in and they could see what happened to their kids. They could see where their kids were coming from, what were their referral reasons. They could see what the permanency rates were 3 years out. And administrators in the system could actually look at all of their programs and see which ones were getting better outcomes and which ones were getting worse outcomes. And one of the interesting things about this system is that not only did it communicate outcomes to providers, but it also communicated the values of the system. That showing someone outcomes of permanency, it's communicating to these providers that in their mind were mental health providers. And yes, you know, all of those kids needed some form of behavioral or mental health treatment. But the goal of the system was to break down the barriers to permanency, to get these kids to permanent placements. And so being able to show that to every provider, I think also had the double benefit of saying not only here is reliable information where you can improve your practice and improve your outcomes, but it's also showing like these are the outcomes that we care about, right? That there's a message there of what the agency wants to see providers doing.
Mm-hmm. And I remember more than one provider was surprised when we created their dashboard, and right up front and center was time to permanency and the percent of the children who left their care and achieved permanency, and how that fit within the spectrum of the types of children that were coming in and out of services like theirs. And there was a surprise because they had not seen that as their primary role in the partnership with the Child Welfare Agency. They thought they were treating behavior. And shifting that allowed that provider to see themselves as a player in the role of moving a child towards permanency, and to really reiterate that conversation and put all of those shared values on the table within that conversation with the Child Welfare Agency.
And you know, broadly, if we, you know, I think permanency is one example, but there's so many stages in the child welfare system where other states could replicate this process of just thinking about, like what data do I already collect? And what if I put that data in front of providers, in front of caseworkers? That's going to change behavior, and the research suggests that it's going to improve your outcomes in a meaningful way. And it's almost painful to me to see the data sort of wallowing in these databases with, it takes so much work to collect, and for it to just sit there and not sort of serve a useful function, you know, to present it in a visual, colorful, friendly way, that data has 10 times the value that it does when it's just sitting there in those web forms or in those databases.
Absolutely. I want to use your example too, because one of the areas that's very important to me is the overrepresentation of Native kids. That is a problem nationwide. And I always struggle within my own environment to make that a priority issue, because our agency has multiple numbers of initiatives and priorities at any one time. And sometimes when you work with a special population, which is the smallest minority, sometimes the issues in the child well-being of those communities might be overlooked. So when you have data that's collected on Native kids and it's put in a way that can be seen and understood in a short amount of time. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges every year does their research on Native children and overrepresentation. And so I'm able to take those charts to our leadership and say, here's where we're at in an instant. And you know, less than a few minutes, they can see what's the extent of the problem within Utah, you know, what are the trends and what we need to do. So it doesn't take an intensive amount of time to educate someone when they can simply see where we're at. So I love data visualization. I think it's especially helpful for smaller communities such as Native Americans who have often been overlooked.
Well, and Michaela, your experience is that it's been helpful to know your audience.
Yeah, and just kind of even going off what you said about data that you can understand. And so, yeah, data visualization to me, it's important to know your audience. So if my finance committee is asking for numbers, they typically want the raw numbers. They want to know, we have 20% left, money to raise before the end of this fiscal year. However, if I'm speaking with, the community or potential foster adoptive parents, they want to know how, this data leads to impact, how many, it's going to pull on their heartstrings a little bit more. This amount of money, impacts these children how. And so really important to know your audience, because if, you're showing huge graphs and lots of numbers to people that's not going to speak to them, then it's not really useful.
And we have actually a few recommendations for what you can do to incorporate feedback in your work and what makes a good feedback process. And some of those issues have come up today already. So talking about being timely, not waiting for data to be processed and getting it back, but taking the effort to get it to them as quickly as possible. And so in the example of working with service providers, those data visualizations refreshed nightly so that they're looking at real-time information about the children underneath their care, being specific and focused on the positive when possible. Being iterative, so not just putting it out there and then moving forward and never coming back and double checking whether or not this is the most useful information or is what we need to be seeing or is where we still want to be focusing our efforts. But also oriented towards joint problem solving. So knowing your audience and what is actionable to them. So there's also useful advice around having a plan to deal with conflicting feedback, should it spark a conversation. And looking for places where you can look at the technology that you already have in place and leverage that. So, Michaela, can you provide an example of how useful it can be to create regular feedback points?
Yeah. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, thinking about before a problem gets too big with staff. So, having those regular feedback points with staff, whether that's weekly or bi-weekly, checking in, saying, how are you feeling? How does your workload look? Can you have another case? That sort of thing. And then I also think about caregivers. So our foster and adoptive parents, we have them complete what we call foster parent input on an annual basis. And so that tells us, how are our caseworkers doing? Are you getting the services that you need? Is our caseworkers timely to their visits? Is there anything that we could be doing better? And so those are things we do ask regularly, but then we have that, that form that they complete once a year. But that helps us know what we can be doing better to help retain them, help children stay stable in their placements and things like that. So very important, to just gather that feedback.
And I think that's kind of similar to what we do with our tribes in Utah. We looked at our numbers to see which tribes had the largest number of kids in our care, and we decided that we would set regular meetings with them to get feedback from the tribes. So, for example, the Navajo Nation, quarterly we meet with them, and we call it our intergovernmental agreement meetings, and we sit down. Sometimes we go to Window Rock, Arizona, and we'll meet there. Sometimes they'll come to Utah, but we have regular, consistent feedback with them that not only helps with our relationships, but it also helps in the outcomes with our kids, because we talk about difficult cases, we improve communication, and we avoid that problem at the end, that terrible case that no one wants to, put their hands on. But we've really found that, that consistent, regular feedback face to face has been so beneficial for our work with our tribes in Utah.
So what kind of advice can we offer for people who are watching today about ways to incorporate feedback into their own culture and create an environment where evaluation is highly valued? How can we help people who want to use data and information in their everyday practice to really incentivize that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that I would recommend to people is to think about what's the outcome you want.
Yeah.
You know, is it safety? Is it permanency? That thinking about that ultimate outcome that you want, and then thinking about how do you measure it? Is it collected somewhere already? And the next step is the hard one, and I think it's something that a lot of different behavioral science disciplines aren't good at, but then you have to get good at working with people who are outside of your discipline. You know, you have to learn how to work with IT people, computer science people. And the thing that you hear from those domains, when I work with computer scientists, this is a thing that you hear from students all the time is, you know, I want to do a project that helps the public good. And you say, well, that's great. You know, what do you want to do? And they go, I don't know. So if you have ideas where people in those technical domains can really have an impact, they're excited to do it. They just don't know how they can help. And the key thing is to use all of those principles of taking the data that's oftentimes already collected and bringing it to the people that are making those decisions. And you take what right now is what we call an unreliable environment. By that I mean one where just outcomes aren't part of what's happening, and you make it a reliable environment, one where people can learn based on their experience and get better over time. And it's a hard thing to do. It's sort of almost a career commitment that you have to make, that this is going to be something that you value, that you put resources towards. Right. And it takes years. And then the most important thing is, I think one of the pitfalls here, that you see this in a lot of different domains, but especially criminal justice, is that the data can't be used in a punitive way. That you have to build a culture that uses that data in a way to improve practice, and where you really look at data objectively and think, how can we do better? And that if you use it to punish people, it's not going to be valuable data anymore. People are going to start gaming the data, and whatever metrics you had will start to be useless.
I would even take that one step further and say not just take the data to the people who are using it, but take the data to the people who the data is about. So really building families into that process as well, asking the youth and the families that are the origins and the keepers and the experts of that information to not just look at what it is that we are collecting about them, but also to be involved in how we are storing that information and how that information is being communicated back out as a story about them, because they are the experts in their own data. I've worked on projects where bringing in a client, a child, a caseworker, and having them provide input into not just what information is collected, but how it is recorded and how it is stored and how it is reported back, and looking at that end-to-end cycle of that information created a stronger connection between information, and there was an authenticity to the data and an accountability to the data that hadn't been there before.
I think it's important that we institutionalize this process, and especially, you know, as I've said earlier, making sure that you're including all of your special populations. I feel that, you know, often communities like tribes that have been marginalized and have really struggled, it's important that you learn from them. How is the best way to get feedback from that tribe in particular? You know, as the Indian Child Welfare Program Administrator for Utah's Division of Child and Family Services, I often get caseworkers and admin and people that come to me and say, well, Lisa, what does the tribe think about this? And I have to redirect them and say, you know, it's not my job to interpret the tribe's cultural values or how they feel about things. Our process is to go directly to the tribe and hear from them. And I think that that's a really important thing as we're working with tribes to understand that, you know, there's over 570 different tribes, and they're all different, unique, and diverse. And we need to honor those tribal governments by developing individual relationships with them. And so sometimes when we think about feedback, we think about it in terms of how are we going to use that information? You know, what's it going to do for us? What's it going to measure? And I look at it more in terms of getting that feedback as an important element to developing trust with that tribe. And developing trust with that tribe is going to help those tribal children to thrive. And so that's how we look at feedback and how it's been helpful in our practice.
This has been a great discussion. Do you have any final thoughts as we come to the end of our discussion?
You know, we've had a lot of discussions about how we can use data to improve our child welfare system as a means to provide feedback. And I think there are some pitfalls that we have to be careful of that I think most people stumble into. I know I have. You know, when you are working with data and you want to use data as a method to provide feedback, I think those of us who work in data, you know, you've got some figure, it's got labels on it, and you show it to people and you're kind of thinking like, don't you see? Right? Like you're thinking this figure speaks for itself. And you learn really quickly that almost nothing speaks for itself. And that even the figures that you think are very simple can seem really complicated to people who are coming into a meeting. They were talking about something else 20 minutes ago, who haven't been really deep into it like you have. And so I think there are some good rules of thumb. One of them, I think, is to, you know, in addition to providing data as a means of feedback, is there needs to be an implementation plan around giving that feedback. You can't just sort of drop data in people's laps and just say, you know, there you go. There has to be a plan for helping people interpret it, for helping people understand it. You know, it's the same thing we tell our kids, you know, you need to use your words. That if you can't, when you put up a figure, tell a story around it, that the people in the room are going to be lost. And, you know, there has to be some kind of match between the data that you're presenting and the people who are looking at it. When you're talking about frontline providers, there has to be a lot of support. We used to have someone whose job it was to call people on the phone and do screen shares and walk them through different aspects of that dashboard that we showed, because we didn't assume that people were going to just understand what it meant. The sort of level of the data has to be appropriate for the audience. I remember working with public mental health providers and creating the same kind of feedback system for them. And I thought a line chart where it was showing the change in something over time would be pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And it turned out what worked best for them was just a single bar chart with a line indicating what good performance was. You know, it's basically the most basic figure that you could provide. And even then, you know, it's you really need to be able to talk about the data, to be able to integrate the story of what that data is saying with what's going on a day-to-day basis. Great example is that the figure that we were talking about that was showing permanency rates. You know, people said, this doesn't make any sense to me. I'm a mental health provider. And so to be able to not just talk about the data in terms of what it means, this is the percentage of permanency and this is, you know, your permanency rate compared to other people, but actually being able to say, I'm glad you said that. You know, in addition to being a mental health provider, you know, the state wants you to really be focused on, you know, removing barriers for a kid to obtain a permanent placement. And so to be able to tie it back to not just the data, not just what it means, but what that provider's day-to-day life is. You know, how does showing the permanency rate relate to what they're going to do with a kid on a day-to-day basis? You know, what can they do to improve those outcomes? And so the data is a starting place. And I believe, which almost in a way that doesn't make sense, that you can actually just give people outcomes and it will improve practice, but that's not the best way to do it, right? That if you also give them information on the processing of that task, that is how they improve those outcomes, you know, helping them get to a place where they do better, that's going to be a much quicker way to get what you want out of your system and to improve the system in a way that's impacting, you know, real families, real kids.
Well, there needs to be a culture built around using information, and it has to be viewed as a way to get to a solution. So there's examples in Utah of times when we have relied on data to get the information to move towards a better outcome.
Absolutely. You know, the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed in 1978 created priority placements for Indian children. For both foster care and adoption, the first priority placement is extended family. And when we looked at our data, you know, our numbers weren't where I thought we would be, given that we have this federal law that creates this priority placement. So we really worked with our partners to figure out what are the issues and the challenges that we heard back were kind of surprising to me. Some of the challenges from our workers were, Elisa, do you really expect us to move this child from Utah to Arizona when the family lives in a Hogan? You know, and I would say absolutely, yes, that's exactly what the plan is, so they can be with extended family. But I understood that there were challenges, and so as a way to address that, we decided to work with the Navajo Nation and do an immersion program where we took caseworkers, we took admin, we took the Attorney General's office, Guardian Ad Litem's office, and we worked with the Navajo Nation Indian Child Welfare Act workers, and we actually had the opportunity to go see a kinship placement where a child did live in a one-room Hogan without running water and with a dirt floor. And those things that maybe on paper would be a barrier to a kinship placement, but standing in that wonderful home and seeing this little boy thrive with living with his grandfather, learning the traditional medicine ways, you know, and learning Navajo at his neighborhood school, and having his extended family come home every summer and having those connections, you know, that changed people's perceptions of putting someone in a placement out of state in something that we're not familiar with. So the data is important. I think it helps understand that there are problems or barriers, and then how you approach that has to be specific to, you know, your agency, your state. But you know, with the work with tribal governments, and I think the most important thing is to understand that, you know, you have to see things from their eyes. You know, the numbers are important, they tell a story, but we really have to go and learn as much as we can about that community and develop those relationships and see it from their perspective.
Wow, Elisa, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that example that you shared is huge. And I just wanted to take a second to thank you guys you guys taught me so much just in this little conversation. So just thankful that I got to be here with you guys.
Same here.
Yeah, it's been a fun opportunity. I really appreciate hearing each of your perspectives, and you know, it really makes me think, what do I need to go back home and improve on? And so it's really been beneficial for me today to meet with each of you.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for joining us for this session. We look forward to seeing you in our next session.